One of the big questions when we think about Brexit, there's been lots of debate, lots of conversation, lots of public discussion within the UK, within Europe, naturally. But when we think of Brexit, very often there's a series of claims about what Brexit could offer, why it's not working, why Brexit now is such a mess. And certainly with those who campaigned for Brexit, there were a lot of hopes and I may say fantasies attached to Brexit. Hopes for regaining national sovereignty, to retake the nation, to believe in Britain, to become strong again and liberate yourself from the alleged Brussels or European oppression. But one question that we can talk a lot about, like how fantastical these ideas are, how realistic they are, how feasible they are. And in many ways, over the last 3 years, people in the UK and the UK government and the parliament have figured out that actually many of these proposals that were floating around and the hopes that were associated with Brexit are not that feasible, not that easy to translate, and economically, most likely creating a self-inflicted wound. But putting all of that aside about the pros and cons of Brexit, one thing that hasn't been discussed enough, in my view, has been the question of democracy. And to some extent, both major parties in the British Parliament, the Tories as well as Labour, and much of the public debate within the UK and outside of the UK has focused on a notion that basically there was a democratic referendum, and this democratic referendum ultimately legitimizes only one option, and that is leaving the European Union. So any talk about a second referendum, about revisiting and potentially revising this decision has been seen as democratically illegitimate, because the one vote, the one close referendum in 2016 was taken as the kind of democratic decision where the people raised its voice and where the people made their decisions on the future of the UK and the future within the European Union, rather actually leaving the European Union. And my take on this is that this notion of democracy is essentially flawed. It has been taken as a common sense, it's taken for granted, but it actually is not what democracy is about. Democracy from a democratic theory point of view, and no matter how you look at this, if you're more the kind of deliberate democracy person who thinks that to some extent democracy, public participation in democratic elections or even democratic referenda are to some extent co-original and closely linked to rights entitlements, civil rights, and ultimately good and reasonable decisions. Or if you think actually there's a paradox in democracy, that actually democratic majorities can potentially make wrong decisions, can actually undermine the very democratic project. No matter what you think about that, ultimately democracy is more than just a single vote in a single moment as it was in 2016. Democracy is a complex ensemble of various aspects of decision making, of raising your voice, of engaging in public debate. And ultimately also it is about the capacity to revise decisions that might be flawed. And so the most democratic thing to do, this is what I would argue, is actually to have a second referendum. A second referendum that would be based on 3 years of public debate. Basically deliberative democracy at its work. 3 years of thorough debate of what are the real options about Brexit. What are the real possibilities and limitations of such a step? What does it really mean for society? And the complexities of that really just came out in the last 3 years. And we also had, by the way, a consistent majority of British voters actually in polls in the last 3 years in favor of remaining in the European Union. But even putting this aside, no matter what the decision would be, the most democratic thing from the point of view of democratic theory would be to have another referendum, to have another public engagement. Once you started the process of including referenda in the democratic process, once again, democracy entails more than just a single vote at a given moment in time, a certain moment of public articulation. It entails rights, it entails policy making, it entails questions of feasibility, it entails democratic representation. But the most democratic thing to do in light of the situation today, and in light of the fact that there was a very close decision 3 years ago, a lot of public engagement and debate over the next 3 years would be now to have a second referendum.
Another extension was agreed at the European Council summit to prevent a no-deal outcome on April 12th. Of course, now the big question is what purpose this extension is going to serve. And I am not convinced that it's actually going to help the UK reach a decision. I think for the EU, the main purpose of the extension was to avoid any blame for a no-deal outcome, and also to give the UK enough time to let the political processes play out. But beyond that, there's really the question of whether removing or easing the time pressure is going to help the UK reach a decision. There are several possible routes through which the UK could possibly reach a decision. The first one could be a second referendum, which Prime Minister Theresa May remains opposed to, and Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn is at least very, very sceptical about, and supports only very reluctantly under huge pressure from his party. So given both leaders' reluctance, it looks quite unlikely that this is going to go ahead, not least because the indicative vote process in the UK Parliament has shown that there's actually not a majority for this option in Parliament. The second route through which a decision could be reached would be a general election. However, again, that might be fairly unlikely because the Conservatives have very little to gain in a general election if they have to basically campaign without having delivered their promise of leaving the EU. Similarly, some smaller parties have very little to gain. The Northern Irish Democratic Unionist Party would probably lose its key role in currently propping up Theresa May's minority government, and therefore they would lose a lot of leverage, and the newly formed party Change UK might very well be wiped out. So it looks like most MPs don't have an incentive to vote for an early election, which again makes this outcome quite unlikely in the coming 6 months. Another possible decision would be a compromise between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. But again, it is quite unlikely that the cross-party talks are going to lead anywhere because there are 3 quite big sticking points that could present problems. First, there is the question of the customs union. It is Labour's position that the UK should remain in a customs union with the EU after Brexit. However, Theresa May is still opposed to that. And not least because membership of a customs union would basically make it much more difficult for the UK to have its own independent trade policy. And this idea that the UK could become a big trading power and have its independent trade policy is really the last remaining potential economic benefit of Brexit. So to basically give that away, even though of course it's questionable as to what extent the UK actually would succeed in having would have a very successful trade policy. But still, to give that away would be quite a big step for a lot of Brexiteers in the Conservative Party. The second sticking point would be a second referendum. Jeremy Corbyn is quite sceptical about it, but many in his party have said that they would only support a deal if there was another vote. And the last sticking point would be a sort of mechanism to bind future governments, because what Labour is really worried about is that Corbyn and Theresa May now agree a compromise. Based on that, they ask the EU to change the political declaration. The EU says yes, and then Theresa May stamps down, and a Brexiteer, someone like Boris Johnson, takes over power, rips up the political declaration, and Labour has still supported the withdrawal agreement, but is now basically left with an outcome that it doesn't consider desirable. So Labour's concern really is that finding a mechanism to prevent that is really difficult. So it would have to trust that Theresa May is still going to be in power for the next phase of the negotiations, but that again looks very unlikely. So this issue of the lack of trust is another potential sticking point. And those three issues make it quite, I think, make it quite unlikely that May and Corbyn are going to find a compromise. And for those reasons, because it's very much possible that we're not going to get a conclusion, and that means that at the end of October, when the next extension runs out, we might be in the same position as now, with no decision and pressure on the EU to give the UK another extension. And the EU has already signaled that it is willing to go quite far to avoid a no-deal outcome. So it is very much possible that it will grant the UK another extension. And yet, what the EU really wants to avoid is a circle of one extension after the other that continues to divert attention from other pressing issues and where Brexit continues to consume most of the EU's time and energy.
What I want to talk about is the relationship or the impact of Brexit on Central and Eastern European member states of the European Union. And of course, the United Kingdom has always been a very important partner for these countries ever since the end of the Cold War. And in particular, Britain has been important as an ally for these countries within the EU. So you can imagine that after the day after the Brexit referendum, there was a real panic among foreign policy elites in a number of these Central Eastern European member states of the EU, because they have been were relying on the UK very much in a number of areas, both externally in EU external relations, but also internally as an ally in EU internal politics. Externally, the most important dimension was clearly the transatlantic ties, because both Central European EU members and Britain have been rather supportive of a strong security relationship with the United States, and a bit skeptical towards the development of the European security pillar. But this also applies to the relations with Russia, for instance. Both Central Europe and Britain have been rather distrustful of Russia's intentions. And as you can understand, Britain is very difficult to replace in this relationship by France or by Germany. But it also applied to EU internal politics, because both many Central European countries and Britain have been rather skeptical towards deeper integration in a number of areas, ranging from tax harmonization, deeper integration in monetary policy, but also foreign security policy in some dimensions. So the consequence of the referendum and of Britain leaving the European Union is the need for a radical reorientation of the Central and Eastern European member states. They have been cultivating for a number of years a policy of what we might call a fence sitting, saying yes and no at the same time to a number of policies. A prime example of that would be the common currency. Countries like the Czech Republic would say, well, we want to adopt the euro, but at the same time not really willing to fulfill the criteria, so that we can stall and leave it for a later moment. And this is an example of how these countries proceeded in a number of areas. But now with Britain leaving, this will not be possible anymore. So they will have to decide either to really join the core, which also means being more connected to their most important economic partners, but at the same time having less room for maneuver. Or they will openly declare that they want to stay on the sidelines, having more free room for their individual policies, but at the same time less influence on EU decision making, especially as far as the Eurozone is concerned. So this is a very important moment for these countries to decide. And what I think will be the main consequences for these countries of Britain leaving the European Union will in fact be the fact that these countries as a bloc will cease to exist, because they will institutionally decide differently to belong or not to belong to the core. Their preferences, which are or have been diverging for some time, will diverge even farther. And in fact, the result of that will be a fragmentation, and it will not make sense anymore to talk about the so-called new member states of the EU anymore.